Hello everyone. So in this session, we'll be looking at the pulp chambers and canals of primary teeth, and we'll be looking at clinical relevance in terms of pediatric dentistry, and we'll be also comparing the primary and permanent teeth. Now, first of all, if you just look at the child above in this picture, and he has perfect pearly whites, and you can see that he has perfect teeth. And the image just right below it, you can see the same child who has a lot of cavities in his front teeth. So why does this happen? So why does caries process takes place much faster in primary teeth as compared to permanent teeth? And we see a lot of children these days that they have these multiple caries lesions, which are known as uh, early childhood caries. So in this video session, we'll be looking at the reasons or the morphological basis of differences between the primary teeth, and why does the caries process takes place much faster in primary teeth as compared to permanent teeth. So these are our learning objectives, that we'll be looking at the pulp morphology in the primary teeth as compared to the pulp morphology in the permanent teeth. Secondly, we'll be looking at the clinical relevance of these morphological differences between the primary and permanent teeth, and how does it affect uh, the pain and the progression of caries in primary teeth. So as far as primary teeth are considered, they are comparatively different. They are morphologically distinct from the permanent teeth. Now, if you just look at this comparison, on the right hand side, what we see is the permanent second molar, and on the left hand side, we have a maxillary primary teeth. So, uh, so the major differences that we'll be looking at each of these differences from the perspective of the crown, from the perspective of dentine, and the perspective of the roots. So briefly, or just summarizing, the main differences is that the primary teeth, they differ significantly in terms of the large pulp horns, and specifically the mesopulp horn, which is much wider and much closer to the enamel surface as compared to the permanent tooth. And another thing is that the thickness of enamel in the primary teeth, it is lesser as compared to the permanent teeth, although it is the thickness of enamel is less in the primary teeth, but it is consistent throughout. And lastly, if we compare the roots of the primary with respect to the permanent teeth, so the roots specifically of the molars, they are much more flared, they are much more apart from each other, and this is to accommodate the permanent teeth. Now we'll look at all of these differences in detail. So the first difference is the pulp chamber. So the pulp chamber, it is much nearer to the occlusal surface, and this is partly due to the reduced or limited amount of secondary dentine, and mostly there is permanent dentine. So if we just compare this difference, so from the pulp horn till the dentino enamel junction, so if we look at it, it is quite less, and this is why, because there is less amount of secondary dentine, and this is reduced secondary dentine thickness. That is why the pulp horns are much more close to the surface, and since they are much more closer to the surface, it means that any caries can easily affect the pulp horns, and the cavity can uh, can progress very fast in the primary teeth because of the reduced dentine thickness. So secondly, because of the reduced dentine thickness, the pulp chambers are quite large in proportion to the crown size. They are high and prominent, as we can see here, and the mesopulp horn is specifically well developed, just as the mesial marginal ridge is well developed, as we have discussed in the generalization of teeth, that the mesial side, the mesial marginal ridge is higher and it is taller, and the pulp horn that is towards the mesial marginal ridge, or the mesopulpal horn, it is also large, and it is much more near to the enamel surface than the other pulp horns. So as far as the enamel is concerned, enamel is thin and it's uniform in thickness, and the dentine thickness is limited because of the limited secondary dentine. So, and this is one of the reasons why caries are progresses fast in these teeth because of the limited dentine thickness. Now we'll move on to the root canal and the root morphology. So the roots are not only they're longer, but they're slender relative to the crown size, and they provide support despite smaller crown dimensions. So roots are much more flared. Flared means they are quite far from each other, as you can see. They're much more far from each other as compared to the permanent teeth, and this is because so as to because the hair is where the developing tooth buds are present. So these flaring actually accommodates the developing permanent tooth buds. Roots are thin, and they thin out rapidly towards the apex. So the apex, not only are the roots slender, but they are thin, and there's reduced in dentine thickness in them. And when they reach the apex, it becomes much more thin. So, and since they are flared out and they're thin and they're delicate, it means they're much more prior to resorption, and that is what is expected. And if the roots are thicker, then they will be very hard to resorb, because these primary molars are those primary teeth which are succutaneous teeth. These teeth are succeeded by the permanent teeth. So now we move to the cervical and structural features. So there's a marked constriction in primary molars as far as the cervical enamel junction is concerned. The cervical ridges are much more prominent, especially buccally. And not only are they prominent, since there's a cervical constriction, so there is actually reduced in thickness of dentine. And the another important feature is that although the enamel thickness is less of primary teeth as compared to the permanent teeth, but the thickness is consistent throughout the enamel crown, and the enamel rods, they slope occlusally at the cervix. So if you just look at it from here, they are actually moving towards the occlusally towards the cervix. This is as opposed to the permanent teeth. The permanent teeth are much more cross-sectional. They are much more towards the cemental junction, but in the primary teeth, they actually slope occlusally at the surface. So in permanent teeth, they're much more, they exhibit gingival slope. So that is the reason, because of the thin enamel and the thin dentine, there is rapid caries progression. And that is why in terms of cavity preparation, in terms of pediatric dentistry, so whenever there's a cavity, we need to be very conservative, and we need to drill less and place minimally invasive restorations in primary teeth as compared to permanent teeth. So this is a table which actually shows the comparison between primary teeth and permanent teeth. And this is also a rapid recall table. And if you think primary, it means there's large pulp and there's thin protection. So briefly, we'll just go through the different dental hard tissues and soft tissues, and we'll compare primary teeth with the permanent teeth. So in the primary teeth, the enamel is not only thin, but it is consistent. It has consistent depth throughout, even in the cervical area. While in the permanent teeth, although it is thick, but this thickness does not remain the same. And towards the cervical area, the enamel thickness actually reduces significantly. So as far as dentine is concerned, in the primary teeth, there's limited secondary dentine and there's reduced dentine thickness. That is why it is much more closer to the surface, and the pulp horns are much more larger in the primary teeth as compared to the permanent teeth, because of the excessive secondary dentine present in the permanent teeth. So lastly, we'll be comparing the roots. The roots are actually flared in primary teeth, specifically the molars. They're much more flared, and the reason why they're flared is because they have to accommodate the permanent teeth. In the permanent teeth, there's less flaring of the roots, and the roots are much more closer to each other. So here we have a primary central incisor on the left and uh, a primary central incisor on the right, and we have a permanent central incisor on the left. So this is a primary central incisor. What we can see here is that the pulp horns are much more closer to the enamel surface, and the reason is why, because of the reduced dentine thickness. And the mesopulp horn is specifically quite high, while in the permanent teeth, you can actually see there's a lot of dentine which is in between the pulp horn and the enamel. So since the pulp horn is quite away from the enamel, so the cavity progresses slowly, and the pulpal involvement is very late in primary teeth as compared to the primary teeth. So, and this is another example of this is upper first primary molar and uh, upper first permanent molar, while compared to the right, where there is upper second primary molar, and then we have the lower second primary molar. What we can see in the lower second primary molars is that, as you can see from here, the pulpar horns are quite large, and they're much more near to the surface as compared to the lower first primary molar, where there's a lot of dentine in between. So it is in pediatric dentistry, it is said that if the marginal ridge is compromised, if there is cavitation which involves the marginal ridge, it means there is pulpar involvement as well. So lastly, just to summarize, is that there's increased risk of pulpal exposure during cavity preparation because of the reduced dentine thickness and the pulp horns being higher and much more near to the surface. So that is why the caries, it actually progresses very fast because the dentine and enamel thickness is less, and the pulpal horns are quite large and they're quite low. Another important thing is that there is cervical constriction present, and because of this, the crown appears bulbous. So, and this can be used as an advantage by placing the stainless steel crowns because they have retention in the cervical area. Lastly, root flaring should be considered when during extraction and instrumentation. So I hope this video session has been useful in knowing that the primary teeth are not just the smaller or miniature version of primary teeth, but they are structurally, morphologically, they are different because of they have reduced enamel and dentine, and the pulp horns are quite high. So thank you.